Everyone loves a good monster story. In the Garden State, the Jersey Devil often gets credit as both our unofficial mascot and as a spectral scourge, stalking the pine barrens and punishing those who call John Taylor's gift by the heretical name of pork roll instead of the good and proper Taylor ham. Fight me. But where the Jersey Devil is, let's be honest, consigned to the realm of superstition and ghost stories, New Jersey did in fact bear witness to a monster that was as real as its 5 victims, and went on to terrorize generations yet unborn. Primal fear, monsters, and a hefty dash of thalassophobia, the Matawan Man Eater. Welcome to Words and Coffee, where we talk interesting history about the Garden State and showcase a bag of small batch roasted goodness. Today's brew is Stumptown Coffee Roasters 100-Mile Organic Blend. And the history is the 1916 Jersey Shore shark attacks. Let's get to it. It was July 1916. The summer was in full swing, and people were enjoying it much like they do today. I mean, their bathing suits were a bit longer, the mustaches were a bit bushier, and we were worried about German submarines instead of Russian ones. But overall, it was a good time on the Jersey Shore. And that was surely the impression of Charles Van Zandt, as his train arrived in Beach Haven, Long Beach Island, the afternoon of July 1st. 25-year-old Charles was in town with his father and sisters for the holiday weekend, hoping to escape their home of Philadelphia for a short while. Unfortunately, this would prove to be the first and only time in recorded history where it would have been safer to remain in Philly. Just to be clear, humor is my coping mechanism for grisly and dark subject matter, and I mean no disrespect to the victims or their memory. But there's going to be more of this. Now, this is what we call the Hell's Doorstep phase of summer. It was hot. Like, really hot. So, while the family was unpacking at the Ingleside Hotel, Charles decided to take the dog and go for a little swim. Fear not, the dog survives. Around 6 p.m., 50 yards from shore, something bit him. Seeing he was in trouble, lifeguard Alexander Ott and bystander Sheridan Taylor bravely went out to rescue Van Zandt, who was still attempting to fend off what appeared to be a large fish. According to witnesses, whatever it was followed both victim and rescuers well into the shallows. This was the first time in U.S. history that a lifeguard had to rescue a swimmer from a shark attack. Unfortunately, they lacked donor blood or hemostat medicine at the time, and there was nothing they could really do to treat the injury to Van Zandt's left thigh, which was a mess. Lacking for options, but wanting to get him at least off the beach, they took him to the nearby Ingleside Hotel and set him on the manager's desk. At 6:45 p.m., Charles Van Zandt died of his injuries. The shark had claimed its first victim. A day or two after the tragedy of Charles Van Zandt, the story mostly faded from public notice. There were a few reasons for this. The mayor from Jaws effect is one of them. Further south, Atlantic City reported record attendance of 250,000 people for the Independence Day weekend. That's a lot of tourist bucks. Wouldn't do for folks to get reluctant about the beach, now would it? It's also worth noting the public perception of sharks in the early 1900s. See, the settled science of the time opined that a shark would not attack someone without provocation in temperate waters. Millionaire Hermann Ulrichs offered a prize to anyone with proof of such, a prize which went unclaimed. There was an account of Ulrichs going so far as to jump off his yacht into shark-infested waters to prove this point, but I couldn't find any corroboration on that, so take it with a grain of salt. Point is, no one expected the attack on July 1st, and they certainly weren't prepared for the one on July 6th. The beaches had remained open. The front page story of the Atlantic City Gazette had to do with a woman whose pocketbook was stolen, and another guy that got into a fistfight, which I think is emblematic of Atlantic City as a whole. In the town of Spring Lake, some 45 miles north of Beach Haven, Charles Bruder and his friend, Henry Nolan, were taking their usual lunch break. A Swiss man, Charles was a bell captain at the Essex and Sussex Hotel. You know what a bellhop is? Gee, I knew a bell could ring, but I didn't know a bell could hop. Well, anyway, the bell captain is their boss. Charles and Henry went for a swim in the employees' section of the beach. A strong swimmer, he was hanging out about 130 yards offshore when he too met with a watery antagonist. As he was treading water, the initial bite caught him somewhere in the midsection. Hearing his screams, a woman on shore pointed Charles out to the lifeguards. Thinking that a red-bottomed canoe had capsized, she didn't realize that the water had turned red with blood. Lifeguards Chris Anderson and George White headed out in a rowboat and pulled Charles from the water. Unfortunately, having been bitten in the abdomen and now with both of his legs severed, he died before they even reached shore. Two awful deaths within a week. By this point, the people were starting to pay attention. A press conference at the Museum of Natural History was convened on July 8th, where scientists attempted to prevent panic. Unfortunately, their tactic amounted to "don't believe your lying eyes," many such cases. And their lackluster reassurance that a third shark attack was extremely unlikely, end quote, was kind of undercut by their failure to explain the first two. Just the experts, bruh. Regardless, at least some people were taking the threat seriously. In some cases, this went a little overboard, no pun intended, where state and municipal governments funded shark bounties and several hunts ensued between New Jersey and New York. Keep in mind, this was hitting local governments right where it matters most: tourist revenue. An estimated drop of 75% attendance followed the July 6th attack, and this was peak summer. I again draw your attention to the mayor from Jaws. At least it spurred them into some kind of action. In Asbury Park, protective shark nets were installed around public beaches and boats patrolled offshore. In one case, also on July 8th, an Asbury Park lifeguard spotted a shark in the water outside the swim area. He went out in a boat and slapped an oar on the water until it swam away. Reportedly, it was 12 feet long. But that fish gets longer every time he tells that story. Huh? Believe me, we'll get into a slew of ridiculous claims that were made at the time. Thankfully, a combination of heavy patrols and shark nets ensured that no more attacks occurred on the beachfront. But the man-eater wasn't done yet. A few days later, we would arrive at the unfortunate main event. Just to set the scene for you a bit, and to underscore how completely unexpected this next part was. Okay, so here are the first two attacks. Beach, beach, a sighting on the beach, and then continuing north, we hit Sandy Hook. Now, at this point, the shark would have had to hook a sharp left into Raritan Bay, skipped Highlands Reach, skipped Pew's Creek, skipped Wayakak, skipped Wayakak Creek, Thorns Creek, but then found its way into Matawan Creek, and then proceeded for another mile and a half before reaching the next victims. If I saw this in a movie, I'd call bullshit. But we get ahead of ourselves. At midday, near the mouth of the creek, retired sea captain Thomas Cottrell was coming back from fishing when he noticed something in the water. He described it as a large dark shape about 8 feet long. Despite this sighting being corroborated by 4 workers and 3 teenagers on a boat, the warning was not taken seriously. Cottrell sprinted back to town and ran down Main Street, warning people. Among those he warned was John Mulsoff, who was both the chief of police and the town barber. Even 100 years ago, a man needed a side hustle. Unfortunately, Mulsoff also thought it was a prank and ignored the warnings. Undeterred, Cottrell then got in a boat and warned a group of boys heading for the creek to stay away. Unfortunately, he missed the group consisting of Lester Stillwell. Lester and his friends did, however, run into the 3 teenagers on the boat that corroborated Cottrell's story. They warned Lester and friends about the sighting, but they also thought it was a joke. This comes to mind. They then proceeded to the swimming hole at Wyckoff Dock. Lester had just gotten off work at the basket factory. He and his 5 friends got into the water. No more than 10 minutes after their encounter with the teenagers, one of Lester's friends said he felt something like sandpaper graze the side of his leg. Not sure what it was, Lester floated into deeper water, and then his friends described what looked like a giant log float toward him in the dark, muddy water. There was a sudden splash, and Lester went under. Still not quite sure what had happened, but realizing their friend was in serious trouble, the other boys fled the creek and ran back to town calling for help. Hearing this, the shop owner, Stanley Fisher, who had ignored the warning from Captain Cottrell, nonetheless sprang into action now. Unfortunately, he and the other 2 men who joined him in a search by boat believed that Lester had had a seizure, and that was the reason he was violently pulled underwater. Again, skeptics. 30 minutes passed. By then, Fisher and the others realized they had no hope of rescuing the boy, but at least hoped to recover his body for his family. Fisher and the others dove into the creek to search the bottom. Little did they know that the shark was still in the area. Not long after they entered, one of the rescuers, Arthur Smith, was scraped in the abdomen. It was rough enough to draw blood and would leave a scar. By this time, a crowd had gathered on the banks of the creek. Despite the injury sustained by Arthur, Fisher decided to attempt one more final dive to recover Lester's body. And he might have succeeded, but just as he grabbed hold of the boy's remains, standing in waist-deep water, the shark got to him first. He attempted to fight the shark, but Fisher was soon pulled underwater by a fish. It's my coping mechanism, okay? Unlike previous attacks, the proximity to shore and the high quantity of witnesses ensured that Fisher was pulled from the shark's jaws and delivered back to land in short order. A local doctor attempted to dress Fisher's severed femoral artery, but he was unable to entirely stabilize it, owing to the limitations of the time and setting. Thus, they decided to transport him to Long Branch Monmouth Memorial Hospital. Except this was 1916 and they had to wait for a train in order to get him there. Fisher waited for 2 hours before the train picked him up, but remarkably he held on and actually made it to the hospital, where they rushed him into surgery, but unfortunately he wouldn't make it. At 6:45 p.m., the evening of July 12th, Stanley Fisher succumbed to shock and blood loss, becoming the shark's fourth but not final victim. Brief tangent here because I couldn't find another place for it, but Stanley Fisher's family used the payout from his life insurance policy to donate a stained glass window to a local church. Shortly after completion, it was damaged by the Morgan factory explosion of 1918. Doesn't really have anything to do with the story here, but serves to demonstrate the interconnectedness in the long timeline view of these events. Back to Matawan. About a half-mile from the attack on Lester and Fisher, another group of boys were also playing in the creek, unaware of the recent attack. When word reached them, they made a beeline for the dock ladder to climb out of the water. 4 of the boys made it out, but as 12-year-old Joseph Dunn reached for the dock ladder, something grabbed hold of his foot and pulled him under. Joseph's brother and friends reached in and grabbed hold of him, pulling him by the hand. They kept his head above water, but the shark held fast. A grisly tug of war ensued until the supervisor at the nearby brickyard came over and finally pulled Joseph free. Captain Cottrell had been patrolling since his initial sighting and soon arrived at the new attack site. He delivered Joseph by boat to the doctor, who had just attended Mr. Fisher. As Joseph's injuries were less severe, they brought him by car to St. Peter's Hospital in New Brunswick, where he made a full recovery. 2 days later, Lester Stillwell's body floated to the surface and was finally retrieved, which at the very least gave some closure to his family. Joseph Dunn was released from the hospital after 2 months, making him the 5th and final victim, but the only survivor. And that's it. That's the story of the Matawan Man Eater. Except... As often seems to be the case, this was a tragedy with elements of farce and outright foolishness. I previously hinted at the first component. Scientists of the time were reluctant to admit that a shark in the region posed a threat to humans. In fact, Henry Fowler and Henry Skinner from the Academy of Natural Sciences went so far as to assert that a shark's jaws flat out lacked the power to sever a human leg in a single bite. What do you think they'd do if they found out sharks could fly? Bro, why don't you trust the science? Repeatedly, references to the attack described a large fish, possibly a shark. Possibly. The denial was such that after the first attack on Charles Van Zandt, Barrett P. Smith opined that the attack was not inflicted by a shark, but a sea turtle.
Sea turtles.
Yeah. 4 people dead, and they're blaming Donatello. However reluctant they might have been to reevaluate established dogma, new data is hard to ignore, especially when it comes from the death of 4 people. Thankfully, some were more willing than others to accept this. Robert Murphy and John Nichols of Scientific American wrote, "There is something peculiarly sinister in the shark's makeup. The sight of his dark, lean fin lazily cutting zigzags in the surface of some quiet, sparkling summer sea, and then slipping out of sight, not to appear again, suggests an evil spirit. His leering, chinless face, his great mouth with rows of knife-like teeth, which he knows too well to use on the fisherman's gear, The relentless fury with which, when his hour has at last come, he thrashes on deck and snaps at his enemies, his toughness, his brutal, nerveless vitality, and his insensibility to physical injury.
That is the most metal thing I ever heard in my whole life.
Okay, so ridiculous denial by public officials was one, but to their credit, they eventually got with the facts and went straight to overreaction. This was especially true of Matawan, where locals started dynamiting the creek. And I strongly suspect that this was the result of one guy in the neighborhood who, for some reason, had a stash of explosives in his basement, who was finally like,
I knew this day would come.
Bounties were issued by local governments all the way up to and including the governor for the capture of the shark. The resulting East Coast shark hunt has been described as the largest of its type in history. As a result, hundreds of sharks were captured off the New Jersey coast following this event. Now, my first thought is, aw, followed closely by, there were hundreds of sharks to catch? To be fair, many of these were mostly harmless species like sand tiger or a blue, and they were caught in the safety nets that were installed all along the shore. One of which was a juvenile great white, caught by Michael Scheisser. Wait a minute. Apologies, coping mechanism. Anyway, Mr. Poop caught a great white shark in Raritan Bay on July 14th. The fight was such that it nearly overturned his small boat until he beat it to death with a broken oar. Which, let's be honest, is pretty metal. When examined, it was found to contain about 15 pounds of fleshy material and bones. Interpret that as you will. But the punchline is this: the attack stopped, leading many to conclude that this was the responsible party. There are problems with this. Great white sharks require salt water. Matawan Creek was freshwater. However, there's an interesting solution here. On July 12th, the moon was halfway between gibbous and full, potentially leading to a more extreme tidal shift. Captain Cottrell noted that he spotted the shark coming in with the rising high tide, when the brackish water from the bay would have been flowing upstream. Thus, it is plausible that a saltwater fish could have had a narrow window to venture inland, and the rest, as they say, is history. Okay, so that explains the particulars, but it misses the forest for the trees. Why did these attacks happen in the first place and never since? There have been many theories. You'll notice that it's something of an outlier, historically speaking. And the answer is, there isn't one. Everything has been suggested from dumping garbage to U-boat activity, and none of it quite fits. In the end, I'm afraid it's going to be one of those. But nevertheless, the event would go on to inspire a young Peter Benchley to write Jaws, terrifying generations yet to come. Admittedly, he had to tone it down quite a bit for the sake of believability. That'll about do it for me. If you stuck with me this far, thank you so much for watching. Sources in the description as usual. This has been Words and Coffee. Until next time.